The 13th of June, 1942. Atlantic Avenue Beach, Amagansett, Long Island. Wind scrapes the dunes and lays a cold sheen on the surf. Seaman John C. Cullen walks the midnight patrol line with a hooded lamp cupped in his hand. Sand grinds in his boots, fog hangs low and tight, a shape lifts out of the white, then three more. Men, soaked through, hauling rubber rafts by their grab lines, oars thump once against a thwart and go still. One of the men says he is a fisherman. Another pushes damp bills into Cullen's palm. The message is simple: walk away. Cullen does not. He nods as if the bribe worked, backs into the wind, and then runs the boardwalk to the Coast Guard station at Amagansett. When he returns with an armed patrol, the shoreline is empty, but the beach has a memory. In the wet sand, the patrol turns up German Navy uniforms hastily buried beneath seaweed, wooden crates packed with explosives and fuses, incendiaries sealed against the salt, and the shallow troughs where rafts were dragged clear of the wash. Offshore, a diesel note fades into the night as U-boat U-202 eases off a sandbar and slips back to sea. The first cell of a German sabotage mission called Pastorius has landed and is already moving inland toward Manhattan. The leader is George John Dash, a German who once lived in the United States and knows the cadence of New York. With him are Ernest Peter Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin. 3 days later, a sister team will come ashore near Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, led by Edward John Curling with Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. Their brief is practical and cold. Attack aluminum plants, rail bottlenecks, power stations, canal locks, and bridges. Plant devices in crowded public places to stretch fear far beyond blast radius. Live quiet, work for years if needed. The Abwehr has furnished counterfeit papers, American cash, and a target list. Berlin's premise is that distance and American pre-war neutrality have left the home front porous and complacent. The first crack in that premise opens not at the waterline but in a Washington hotel room. Dash boards a train, carries a briefcase, and calls the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Over long hours, he unspools a map of landings, names, caches, and rendezvous. The Bureau moves. Agents wait at safe apartments, watch train stations, and make arrests in quick succession. The 8 men who believed the Atlantic would shelter them find themselves in a different current entirely, pulled toward a military commission convened under wartime authority. The summer will close with 6 executions in August. 2 sentences will be commuted after cooperation is weighed. The case will live in American legal history under a stark caption: Ex parte Quirin. The pattern was visible even before the rafts touched Long Island. On the 13th of December 1941, 6 days after Pearl Harbor, the Federal Bureau of Investigation secured convictions against 33 members of the Duquesne Spy Ring, the largest espionage case in United States history to end in convictions. Frederick Fritz Duquesne promised Berlin eyes in harbors, ears in factories, hands near fuel docks. He delivered something else. His ring became a lesson in patient surveillance, double handling, and a domestic security service that learned faster than his tradecraft could adapt. By the week of the landings, the United States had layered new systems across the home front. The Office of Censorship, created on the 19th of December, 1941, under Director Byron Price, read cables and mail with an unromantic eye for patterns. Examiners traced cover addresses through neutral ports, flagged recurring hands, and built dossiers on routes and rhythms. They did not flash badges, they fed leads. Those leads met naval radio intelligence on the coasts, met watch lists at ports and railheads, met bureau case files already thick with taped calls and transcripts. Another actor came online the very day Dash hit the sand. On the 13th of June 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the order establishing the Office of Strategic Services under William J. Donovan. The charter pointed outward: foreign intelligence, sabotage, special operations. Its counterintelligence arm, soon called X-2, would map German case officers in Lisbon and Madrid, track couriers through neutral cables, and pass American-relevant threads back to Washington. Across the Atlantic, British MI5 ran the double-cross system, folding captured Abwehr assets into controlled channels that shaped what German handlers thought they knew. To a desk in Berlin, the paper still read clean. To men stepping off rafts at night, the country no longer felt unguarded. Everything returns to that first human hinge. A young Coast Guardsman pockets a bribe and keeps walking. A patrol digs in the sand and lifts uniforms still wet with salt. A Manhattan hotel clerk checks in four tired men who say little and keep their eyes down. You can stand at the edge of the tide and think darkness is cover. It is not. It is a spotlight if someone has already drawn a net around the stage. The ocean smooths the channels the rafts cut before dawn. The paper remains. The names remain. The dates remain. The operation that looked safe on a map begins to come apart in real time because procedure, repetition, and quiet rooms full of lists grind against improvisation and luck. In the 13th of June, 1942, ends with salt in the air and a diesel note fading east. But the real pressure builds inland, in offices where doors stay shut and fans push warm paper dust through midnight. The order that morning put the Office of Strategic Services into existence. William J. Donovan takes the charter and points it outward, but his people start stitching lines that run both ways. New York to London, Washington to Miami, Lisbon to Madrid. Names cross desks in cables and pouch letters. The same names come back on different lists with different spellings. You can feel a pattern gathering weight. German planners had started the operation months earlier on a lake west of Berlin. Recruits trained near Brandenburg, learned timers and fuses, learned how to live small inside a large city. They studied American habits from the distance of maps and rumor. The plan assumed ocean still made silence. It did not account for new systems built after December of 1941. The Office of Censorship, under Byron Price, pulled cables and letters off conveyor belts and read them without romance. Examiners tracked cover addresses through neutral waypoints, traced handwriting that reappeared with careful variations, noted the return of a certain ink and a certain closing line. They did not knock on doors. They forwarded flags to those who did. The Federal Bureau of Investigation worked a different tempo. Tape reels turned in wire rooms. Stenographers built clean transcripts. Phone booths near train concourses had eyes on them. A hotel register in Manhattan matched a watch list typed 3 weeks earlier. The Pastorius landings do not look like decisive events to the men stepping off the rafts. They look like the first steps of a long walk to safety. In fact, they mark the point where parallel lines begin to meet. A Coast Guard patrol digs in the sand. An FBI agent sits in a lobby chair and reads a newspaper without moving his eyes. A postal examiner in a steamy warehouse recognizes the same neat slant in the same kind of blue pencil. Across the Atlantic, British counterintelligence is already inside the German script. The double-cross system takes captured Abwehr sources and folds them into controlled channels. The 20 committee meets, names a case with a dry joke, and shapes what goes back to Berlin. The Germans read clean signals and do not see the hand that edited them. That is not the same as arrests on American streets, but it narrows the room the enemy thinks he has. OSS officers in London begin to compare notes with British services. Reports from neutral capitals give the names of case officers who move money and instructions through cafes off the main squares. Those names migrate onto American lists. When a cable or a letter crosses into United States jurisdiction with a familiar pattern, the windows around a suspect grow smaller. George John Dash becomes the hinge. He rides a train to Washington, checks into a hotel, and calls the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The interview that follows does not depend on theater. It is hours in a room, a briefcase on a table, a story that keeps producing corroboration when agents leave to check a detail and return. Names match manifests. Schedules match sightings. Safe addresses match floor plans already sketched by watchers. The arrests start to roll, one man at a time, one station at a time. The momentum shocks the very men who thought the ocean had bought them months. Legal authority catches up to operational speed. On the 2nd of July 1942, the President authorizes a military commission to try the 8 captured men. The caption that will enter the law books forms in stark type, Ex parte Quirin. The hearings move with wartime urgency. The outcome is severe and final. In August, 6 men die in the District of Columbia. 2 sentences are commuted after cooperation is weighed. The country reads the headlines. Berlin reads the after-action reports. The message, to both, is that the American home front runs on procedure now. Beneath the headlines, the systems harden. Navy radio intelligence learns the seasonal behaviors of U-boats near the capes and the islands. Harbor patrols adjust their night routes. Industrial plants install tighter badge controls and rotate guard posts so no one gets comfortable. Railroad yards adopt new checks that make it harder to linger unnoticed with a satchel near a choke point. None of this looks cinematic. All of it stains a saboteur's day with friction. The act of moving a device from a room to a river edge becomes a gauntlet of small tests. Someone asks for the wrong receipt. Someone notices the wrong smell on a jacket. Someone decides to write down a license plate number in a notebook. The net is not a single line. It is the slow, relentless overlap of many lines. The Office of Censorship flags an envelope that uses the same foreign return as a different case. An OSS contact in Lisbon hears that a certain German officer favors a certain tobacconist and prefers a certain phrase in his handoffs. A bureau agent in New York picks up the echo of that phrase in a letter recovered from a dead drop. A Coast Guard officer draws a red pencil circle on a map around a stretch of beach that looks easy at night and very exposed at dawn. You can draw each thread on its own page and fail to see the shape. Put them together, and a picture appears that a raiding party cannot walk through without tripping. What German handlers believed about America at the start of the operation begins to invert. Distance no longer equals safety. Neutrality is gone, replaced by a mobilized bureaucracy with reach. The men on the ground feel it before their superiors admit it. Doors that should open stay closed. Contacts arrive late or not at all. There is always a stranger in the lobby chair. There is always a question about papers that should have passed without a glance. The mission shifts from attack to survival, and then from survival to confession when survival fails. The system does not sprint. It does not need to. It walks and it never stops. The 2nd of July, 1942, Washington, District of Columbia. A typed order slides across a desk in the White House and picks up signatures. A military commission will sit for 8 men captured after the Long Island and Florida landings. The corridor air is heavy and still. Ceiling fans push warm eddies that smell of paste and paper. Agents carry files past guards with fixed faces. The country is at war. The pace is wartime. You are led into a room where the furniture is plain and the stakes are final. The defendants sit in neat rows, flanked by soldiers who do not speak. George John Dash keeps his eyes forward. Edward John Curling studies the table grain as if there is a pattern he can read and follow out of the building. Herbert Haupt looks young in a way that seems out of place here. Lawyers set down sharpened pencils and stacked pads. This is not theater. This is process. Attorney General Francis Biddle assumes the role of prosecutor. Army judge advocate officers fill the benches in trim uniforms. President Franklin D. Roosevelt has ordered the forum, and the forum begins. 2 Army officers are appointed to defend the men, Colonel Kenneth C. Royal and Colonel Cassius M. Dowell. They accept the task as soldiers and as lawyers, and the weight of that double oath settles on every page they touch. On the table are exhibits that still taste of salt. German Navy uniforms dug from wet sand, wooden boxes lined for explosives, timers with factory marks, train schedules with pencil ticks by station names, hotel registers with 4 hands that try to look American and do not quite succeed. Outside the building, the summer presses down. Inside, the clock runs on questions. Where did you land? Who handled your papers? Who gave you your targets? The answers move in low voices. One name corroborates another. A sketch matches a floor plan made by watchers weeks earlier. The routes in and out of safe rooms are the same ones agents mapped by habit and repetition. The story that started in fog and surf now sits under overhead lights and does not look like a story anymore. It looks like a chain. Colonel Royal objects to the forum itself. He argues that these men, though enemy agents, should face trial in federal court. He argues that a military commission is not the rightful place. The challenge rises through channels with wartime speed. The Supreme Court assembles in special session. On the 31st of July, 1942, the court issues a per curiam decision. The commission has jurisdiction. The full opinion will come later, in October, under a stark caption that will outlast everyone in the room. Ex parte Quirin. The ruling does not speak with drama. It speaks with authority. And authority is enough. The hearings return to their grind. Transcripts build into binders. Binders become stacks. Witnesses speak to times and places that can be checked. An examiner from the Office of Censorship describes mail streams and cables that showed recurring hands and cover addresses. An agent from New York lays out the arrests as a sequence of doors and lobbies and station platforms. A Coast Guard officer describes the Long Island night and the way wet sand keeps secrets for only a few hours. The men who believe distance would shelter them now face a system that treats distance as an accounting problem. The facts are cold and specific. 8 names, 2 landing sites, a time window that begins with June landings and ends with July arrests. A command structure in Berlin that handed targets to men who had not walked the streets they were sent to attack. In that mismatch, you can feel the hinge turning. Tradecraft, taught on a lake near Brandenburg, breaks against a country that, by mid-year, has converted its bureaucracy into an instrument. There are no heroics here. There is only pressure applied in many places at once, until the shape of the operation reveals itself and collapses. The 8th of August 1942 arrives with finality. 6 sentences are carried out in the District of Columbia. 2 sentences are commuted to prison after cooperation is weighed. The names are public now, and the case is a headline that folds into memory even as it changes the daily habits of those who read it. Plant guards check badges twice. Hotel clerks look longer at quiet men who pay in cash and leave no bags. Bridge watchmen keep notebooks by their elbows and write down plate numbers without thinking about it. The commission ends, but the bureaucracy it confirmed does not end. It tightens. For the men who built the sabotage plan, the after-action reports cross the Atlantic and land on desks where the margins already hold nervous notes. The premise that America is far and unready no longer holds. The premise that a small team can live for years inside a large city without friction looks different after lists, rosters, censors, watchers, and a home front that has learned to see. What Berlin thought it had in geography, Washington replaces with procedure. You can feel that shift in a quiet room more than on a battlefield. It is the sound of a fan and a pen and a clerk who never misses a line. The commission leaves another trace beyond the law books. It sets a tempo. The agencies learn how to hand a thread from one desk to the next without dropping it. The Office of Censorship refines its flags. The Federal Bureau of Investigation refines its watch lists and its wire rooms. Navy beach patrols redraw their night routes based on where the tide cuts the bars and where a rubber keel might scrape. The newly created Office of Strategic Services tunes its overseas nets and begins to pass back names of case officers who move money and orders through neutral cafes. One by one, those names migrate onto American lists and stay there. Stand in the corridor as the room empties. The chairs are pushed in. The pads are stacked. The guards file out. Nothing looks dramatic. Everything is moved 1 inch closer to permanent. That is how the script breaks. Not with a flourish, with a signature, with a date, with a caption in clean type that says who was tried, where, and why. The 29th of November, 1944, Hancock Point, Maine. The water is black and breathless. Spruce boughs hold frost like glass. 2 men climb out of a rubber boat and stand listening to the shoreline. A diesel heart beats once and sinks away as 1,230 slides back into the Gulf of Maine. Eric Gimpel tightens his coat and checks his pocket notebook. William Colepaugh looks inland toward a road he cannot see. The plan is simple on paper. Reach Boston, reach New York, build cover, report on American shipyards and radar labs, and anything else that matters. Berlin believes the home front is stretched thin by late war demands. The men feel alone, which is what Berlin promised them they would need to feel. They move by bus and train with careful tickets and small talk. The money is new and crisp. The suitcases are heavy. New England slides by in gray windows and crosties. In Manhattan, the winter streets shine with a film of oil and slush. The city swallows strangers by the thousand each day, but the men are not swallowed. They are suspended. The friction starts early. A clerk eyes a signature a second longer than he should. A waiter notes a question asked in a way no regular asks it, and then the tension that no handbook accounts for arrives. Colepaugh quits the mission. He walks away from the man who taught him the signals and the discipline and the stakes. He turns himself in. The moment looks like betrayal inside a cell. It is something else in a field office. It is acceleration. Agents open drawers where watch lists already sit. They pull files with clipped notes that tie routes, hotels, and safe addresses to patterns flagged by sensors and by the quiet exchange between London and Washington. The questions now have rooms to live in. When the rooms are ready, the men are brought to them. Gimpel, the trained operator, feels how quickly his map collapses when one line is pulled tight. Across the ocean, OSS X-2 has been watching the edges of this story in the way counterintelligence watches anything that touches neutral ground. Lisbon is a seam, Madrid is a seam. Couriers cut through those seams with messages that look ordinary until they do not. OSS officers in London, under the station led by David K.E. Bruce, pass names and habits and meeting places that match what mail examiners and cable readers have been seeing for months. The Office of Censorship, 2 winters into its mission, now has a memory of roots and hands that lets it say what does not fit and why. None of this makes an arrest by itself. All of it informs the question that an agent asks first when he sits down across a table from a man who has run out of road. The arrest work is anticlimax when it is done well. Doors, hallways, a small pause before the first question. The trained operator answers, like a trained operator, until the repetitions begin to grind. Names recur. Locations recur. A timetable offered as alibi meets a separate timetable already in the folder. A story that might have lived for months in 1941 dies in days in 1944, because the net that tightened after Pastorius never loosened. It only grew more threads. What the enemy reads as luck is not luck. It is procedure that never sleeps. A second commission forms. The caption is different. The frame is the same. The government chooses the wartime forum again. The arguments about jurisdiction are colder now, because the precedent already sits in type. The defense counsels work the record as far as it will go. The prosecution lays out timetables, exhibits, and the human hinge of a defection that turned momentum. Sentences fall hard in early 1945. Death, then commutations to imprisonment. Years later, clemency will empty the cells and the men will vanish into separate lives, but the operational lesson will not change. The Atlantic does not protect a spy who arrives late to a country that has learned to look. If you trace the lines on a wall map, you see a pattern that feels almost mechanical. A submarine makes a winter landfall on a Maine shore. A defection turns a shadow into a case number. Field offices call a list that was built the previous year. The list calls London. London sends back pieces from Lisbon and Madrid. The examiners pull a file that matches a pen stroke and a return route. The arresting team knows which door to try first. The picture is not a chase. It is an alignment. When it clicks, there is nothing to outrun. By the time the final papers are filed, late war America has settled into a posture that is both outward and inward. Bombers cross coasts in great rectangles. Convoys fold the ocean into lanes. At home, the bureaucracy that learned to catch 8 men in 1942 has matured into something wider. Plant guards are trained to treat strangeness as a reportable event. Hotel clerks are briefed by local police on what to call in and how fast to call it. Bridge watchmen write down plate numbers the way a machinist writes down tolerances. The system is not dramatic, it is dense. Stand again at Hancock Point in your mind. The first footprints fan out from the waterline and then dissolve into the scrub. Dawn lifts, and the surface of the bay looks clean, as if nothing happened. That is a lie the ocean tells every morning. In the files, the path never fades. Names, dates, tickets, receipts. A note in a margin that says, simply, watch this one. The story that opened with a boat sliding off a sandbar near Long Island now echoes in a winter landing in Maine and closes with the same verdict. Tradecraft that looked bold on a lake near Brandenburg breaks when it meets a country that has put names to its seams and watches them without blinking. Spring 1943. Lisbon. The harbor holds gray ships under pale light. The streets speak in many tongues at once. A German case officer crosses a square with a folded newspaper under his arm and a memory of safer days. He believes in the comfort of neutral ground. He believes a cafe can be a wall. Across town, an Allied watcher writes a time in a small book and does not look up. The war has pushed the front line into rooms above tobacco shops and into lobbies where people pretend not to notice one another. The line is quiet, but it is real. Madrid keeps a different tempo, but the same rules. Couriers move between hotel desks and posta restante counters with envelopes that look ordinary until they do not. They angle toward consulates and back out when the path gets crowded. They use phrases that once passed clean, and then one day, those phrases begin to return echoes. British services, deep into the double-cross system, have learned how to bend a channel without breaking it. The 20 committee meets, gives a code name with a dry smile, and shapes the traffic that flows back to Berlin. What reads as confirmation in one office reads as choreography in another. The script remains German. The stage directions do not. OSS X-2, the counterintelligence branch, grows in this light and learns to work sideways. Reports move from Lisbon and Madrid to London stations and then into Washington with a rhythm that becomes a habit. A name on a hotel ledger becomes a note about a handoff spot near a tram stop. A preference for a certain stationery becomes a flag when the same stationery turns up on a different route months later. An Allied pouch clerk handles papers that smell of ink and coal and knows which desk each sheet must see before night. No one action wins anything. The work is the accumulation of small certainties that allow a question to land with weight when an agent opens a file in New York or Boston. Cable and mail censorship add a second lens. By early 1943, the Office of Censorship has a memory. Routes through Bermuda, Lisbon, and Geneva form patterns on wall maps. Certain return addresses recur. Certain hands try to disguise themselves and never quite do. Examiners stand in heat and paper dust, with rubber fingers and pencils, marking the items that do not fit. They write short notes that say little and mean much. Irregular seal, unusual phrasing, repeat cover name. Those notes travel farther than the envelopes they mark. They cross oceans inside pouches and settle onto desks where watchers have already marked the same names from a different angle. Berlin struggles with distance it once trusted. Abwehr veterans who trained men on a lake near Brandenburg find that rules which worked in 1939 ring hollow in 1943. Time is the enemy now. A courier who misses a day becomes a story to explain. A story that must be explained more than once becomes a risk. The risk grows into a file on an Allied desk. The file grows into a list. By the time a man with a suitcase steps off a neutral train and onto Allied soil, the list already knows where he prefers to sit and what he asks for when the waiter comes. He can feel the air thinning without knowing why. You can stand in the Avenida station in Lisbon at dusk and watch how the light makes silhouettes. Each one looks safe because it is surrounded by other silhouettes. That is the illusion neutral cities sell. The Allied answer is patience. It is a first name that matches a false surname in a cable book. It is a room number that appears in two unrelated reports a month apart. It is the note from London that says a certain German officer prefers to carry instructions in a jacket lining and refuses to trust microdots. It is the reply from Washington that says a letter with that officer's habitual closing has just passed through a censor's hands. Connect enough habits, and the habits become a person you can find again. By late 1943 and into 1944, the overseas net and the home net begin to overlap so often that the seam disappears. An OSS officer in London sends a quiet warning about a courier's loop through Spain. A New York field office adjusts a watch list at hotel desks near Grand Central without a meeting or a memo. A cable flagged in a mail barn becomes the reason a plainclothes team lingers by a lobby telephone for an extra hour. The next day, the team learns why. Someone shows up and asks a question in the wrong order. Someone uses a phrase that has been in a report already. Someone looks at the wrong clock on the wall. Nothing in this feels heroic. That is the point. The system that grew out of the shock of 1942 now moves as if it has always existed. It does not have to sprint. It widens. It folds new names into old lists and waits. When the names cross again in a different city or a different season, the file opens at the right page without anyone needing to say a word. That is how the overseas net works with the home net. It is not a trap sprung by a single hand. It is a tide. Step back, and the picture is simple. Neutral hubs gave German case officers room to breathe at the start of the war. By the middle years, those same hubs became mirrors that showed their routines to others. The Office of Censorship learned the routes. British services learned the tone. OSS X-2 learned the faces and the doors. The United States learned to treat a letter, a ticket, and a hotel register as parts of one object. The men who still believed that distance protected them crossed from one map to another without noticing. When they arrived, the map had already closed. Winter 1944 into 1945. Berlin writes memos that sound steady while the floor tilts under the desks. Reports from America do not read like they used to. They have gaps that no one can close with confidence. The ocean that once felt like armor now feels like delay. An officer in a gray office turns a page and sees too many familiar names returning in too many Allied summaries. Neutral cities no longer look neutral. Lisbon and Madrid look like mirrors held up to habits. The script begins to show its seams. The break is not one event, it is accumulation. Operation Pastorius failed in 1942 with arrests, a military commission, and a legal caption that will outlast the men it judged. The return attempt in 1944, landed by U-1000, 230 on a Maine shore, collapses when a defection turns momentum and a field office moves on a file that was ready before the boat ever left Europe. Between those bookends, mail and cable examiners mapped routes through Bermuda, Lisbon, and Geneva until handwriting and phrasing became signatures. British services bent enemy channels with the double-cross system and sent edited confirmations back to desks that did not know they were reading choreography. OSS X-2 pulled case officer names out of quiet rooms above cafes and slid them to Washington. The FBI built watch lists that made hotel lobbies into shallow pools where a stranger could not move without leaving a ring. Inside Germany, the intelligence house changes shape. The old Abwehr, already frayed by failures and suspicion, loses standing and then structure. Senior figures who once trained men on a lake near Brandenburg now defend budgets and reputations while the war eats time. Wilhelm Canaris is removed, then arrested after the July plot, and in the last spring of the war he dies in a camp. Files move, departments merge or are renamed. The words on the doors change, but the distance problem does not. You can rename a branch. You cannot rewind a failure that has already taught an adversary how you move. Late-war American counterintelligence no longer needs to prove the concept. It has a muscle memory. A letter that does not fit triggers a flag that travels farther than the envelope. A phrase that has been heard before triggers a meeting without a memo. A hotel register written in a careful American hand that is not quite American leads to a lobby chair that stays filled until it pays off. There is no chase. There is alignment. When the pieces click, the target discovers that the map was closed before he unfolded it. The men who still try to work the American side of the ocean feel the air go thin. Doors that should open stay shut. A contact who should arrive does not. A waiter looks twice and remembers. A city that normally swallows thousands each day refuses to swallow one more. The mission focus slides from reporting to survival, from survival to improvisation, from improvisation to confession when improvisation fails. The Atlantic, once a cloak, becomes a margin in a case file. Stand again at the edges that define the story. Long Island in June 1942, Washington in July and August 1942, Hancock Point in November 1944. Each scene looks local when you are inside it. Together they show a national system settling into wartime maturity. The Office of Censorship turns paper into maps. The OSS turns foreign rooms into ledgers of names and times. The FBI turns domestic space into a grid where chance has less and less room to breathe. British partners tune the enemy's expectations until the enemy learns the wrong lessons on purpose. The result is not drama, it is density. The thicker the net, the quieter the moment of capture. By the last winter, the realization reaches the desks that matter. America is not porous, it is layered. Neutral ground is not safe, it is reflective. Distance is not protection, it is latency. The lesson lands late because the war taught it slowly, one routine at a time. When it lands, there is no remedy left that can be applied in months. The war clock is almost out. The files, however, are permanent. Names, dates, routes, rooms. A chain that begins in fog and surf and ends in records that will teach others what to look for when the next ocean promises safety. The 29th of October 1942, Washington District of Columbia. The Supreme Court releases the full opinion in ex parte Quirin, and the words settle like weights on a shelf. The reasoning is dry, the effect is not. It gives a frame that agents and lawyers will work inside for the rest of the war. The building hums with quiet traffic. Clerks carry bound pages down corridors where the light is always the same. The caption becomes a hinge between what men tried on a beach and what the state did in a room. Winter turns, and the files thicken. Navy beach patrols replace horses with jeeps on some stretches, keep horses on others, where tires sink and hooves do not. Factory guards drill badge checks the way machinists drill tolerances. The Office of Censorship marks new routes on wall maps that look like weather charts. Stream by stream, the mail and cable flows gain a history that can be read. Pattern turns into policy. The 9th of April 1945. Flossenburg. Wilhelm Canaris dies in a camp yard after a drumhead judgment, and a long era in German intelligence ends with a knot and a length of rope. In Berlin, the rooms are smaller now, and the voice is lower. The Navy pulls back. The U-boat war croaks in bursts. The men who believed in distance run out of distance. The last signals home sound like habit, and are treated like habit by the people who read them. There is nothing left to pivot on. February 1945, Boston and New York. The return attempt that began on a black Maine shore reaches its own legal end. Erich Gimpel and William Colepaugh stand in a wartime forum whose shape was settled 3 years earlier. The testimony has a familiar grain. Tickets, rooms, envelopes, names. The sentences come down hard. Death. Then a turn. Commutations to imprisonment follow in the same year as armies cross rivers far away. Years pass in concrete and steel. In 1955, the gates open for Gimpel, and he is deported to a country that has changed its maps and its memory. Colepaugh follows a different calendar and walks free later, after a country adjusts its mercy and moves on. The headlines are smaller by then. The war is photographs on living room walls and a note in a service record tucked in a drawer. The infrastructure does not fade. The OSS dissolves in October of 1945 and leaves behind people, habits, and a conviction that foreign rooms matter. In 1947, a new statute gives those habits a home and a name, and the work that began in borrowed offices inside a city at war becomes a permanent fact. The Office of Censorship closes in November of 1945, but its practitioners have already handed their muscle memory to younger services. The Bureau keeps its watch lists and its wire rooms, and learns to live with peacetime restraint wrapped around wartime lessons. What looked like improvisation in 1942 stands in 1946 as procedure. You can trace the end of the German script along a line of small choices rather than a single break. A bribe offered on a wet beach and pocketed as evidence. A hotel register signed in a hand that tries to pass and does not. A clerk who notices an accent bent a degree too far toward American. A censor who writes irregular seal on a card at 3 in the morning and never knows who will read it. A junior officer in London who adds a minor habit to a name and puts both in a pouch. A Coast Guard watch that listens for diesel and hears it once and never forgets the tone. None of these acts fills a headline by itself. Together they become a boundary no one can cross without shedding pieces. Stand in the places where the story hinged and listen. Atlantic Avenue Beach, on Long Island, before dawn, in June 1942. Fans over heavy air in a hearing room in July. The quiet lobby of a Manhattan hotel, where a man who believed in an ocean sits and reads with his eyes on the same line too long. Hancock Point under winter stars in November 1944. The corridor outside a courtroom door in early 1945, while a guard shifts his weight and watches dust float in a bar of light. There is no flourish in any of it. The net does not close with a snap. It closes because it is everywhere at once and has time. The men who thought America was distant learned a different geometry. Distance equals delay, not safety. Neutrality equals reflection, not cover. Bureaucracy equals memory. The lesson arrives late because it can only be learned by living inside it, one file at a time. By the time it lands, there is nothing to repair and nowhere to run. In the archives, the paper does not age at the same rate as faces. Names remain, dates remain, receipts remain. A single pencil note survives on a fragile form that says, "Watch this one," and points to a margin where the hand pressed a little harder. You can feel the room again when you read it. You can hear the fan. You can hear the street outside. What looked safe from a lake near Brandenburg was never safe here after the first night. The ocean washed the footprints away. The ledger did not.